The alarm screamed through the research building at 3 in the morning, and Claire Morrison jumped from her bed with her heart racing fast in her chest, like a drum that would not stop beating, and she grabbed her coat from the chair near the window before running down the metal hallways of New Haven Colony toward the emergency bay, where lights flashed red against white walls. Kate Sullivan stood at the main entrance with her weapon drawn, and her face looked stern in the darkness as she turned to see Claire approaching with quick steps, and she pointed toward the outer fields, where something moved in the shadows beyond the perimeter lights that cast long shapes across the grass and dirt. 2 small figures huddled near the fence, and they trembled in the cold night air with their arms wrapped around their thin bodies that seemed almost transparent in the moonlight, and their ears came to sharp points at the top, like nothing Claire had ever seen before in all her years, studying alien life forms across the galaxy. The children cried out words that made no sense to anyone listening, and their voices carried pain that needed no translation to understand as they clutched their stomachs and tears rolled down their pale cheeks that glowed faintly with a light that came from within their skin, like stars trapped under glass. Maya Chen ran up beside Claire with her translation device held out in front of her face, and she pressed buttons frantically trying to find a language match in the database, but the screen showed only error messages in bright red letters that blinked over and over again, with no results. Claire moved closer to the fence and knelt down to bring herself level with the children who looked at her with eyes too large for their faces and filled with fear that made her chest tighten with emotion. She tried to keep professional but could not fully control in moments like these. One child reached through the fence bars with a hand, so small and delicate it looked like it might break from the slightest touch, and Claire took that hand gently in her own, and felt how cold the skin was, like ice that had been frozen for centuries in the deep darkness of space, far from any sun. Kate suddenly raised her weapon toward the sky and shouted for everyone to take cover, as a massive shadow passed overhead, blocking out the stars and moon with wings that stretched wider than any aircraft in the colony fleet, and scales that gleamed like metal in the dim light from the perimeter towers. The creature circled above them with movements so graceful they seemed impossible for something so large, and its eyes glowed with the same light that came from the children below, as if they shared some connection that went beyond simple coincidence or chance. Claire looked up at the beast and then back at the children, and she understood in that moment that they belonged together somehow, and separating them would be wrong in ways she could not yet explain, but felt deep in her bones like ancient knowledge passed down through generations. The dragon let out a sound that was not quite a roar, but more like a song of sadness that echoed across the empty fields and bounced off the colony buildings and made everyone who heard it feel a longing for something they had lost long ago, but could not remember clearly anymore. Defense systems around the colony came online with mechanical sounds of weapons loading and targeting lasers, painting red dots across the dragon scales that reflected the light back in scattered patterns, like a disco ball made of armor and ancient power. Claire stood up fast and turned to Kate with urgency in her voice, as she spoke quickly about not firing, and not treating this as a threat because the children needed help, and the dragon was clearly protecting them, not attacking the settlement. Kate hesitated with her finger near the trigger, and her training told her to eliminate threats before they became problems, but her heart told her something different as she looked at the crying children who seemed so helpless and afraid. Maya finally got a partial translation match, and the words that came through the device made everyone freeze in place, as the meaning became clear through the static and broken syllables that formed slowly into English. The children were saying they were hungry, and it hurt, and they needed help, and they had nowhere else to go, and their world was gone, and everyone they loved was dead, and they were the last ones left. Claire made her decision in that single moment, and she ordered Kate to stand down and open the gates and bring the children inside, where they could be examined and helped, and she told the defense systems to power down and let the dragon circle without interference. Kate looked at Claire with doubt written across her face, but she followed orders, because she trusted the doctor's judgment even when it seemed crazy to let unknown aliens into their home where families slept and children played and life continued in the fragile bubble they had built so far from Earth. The gates opened with a grinding sound of metal on metal, and Claire walked through first with her hands held out to show She carried no weapons and meant no harm to the frightened children who watched her approach with hope, growing in their strange, glowing eyes. The children stumbled forward on weak legs that barely held their weight, and they fell into Claire's arms, as she caught them and felt how light they were, like holding birds with hollow bones made for flight. But these children would never fly without help. Maya and Kate carried the children inside to the medical bay, where white lights hummed overhead, and equipment beeped with electronic sounds that filled the sterile room with noise and activity. As Claire began her examination of these mysterious beings who had appeared from nowhere, the dragon continued to circle above the colony through the rest of the night, and its shadow passed over and over like a clock marking time until the sun began to rise on the horizon and paint the sky with colors of orange and pink and gold. Claire discovered strange things in her scans of the children, and their biology made no sense according to any classification system she knew from her years of training and study across multiple worlds and species. Their cells contained energy patterns she had never seen before, and their bodies were shutting down not from lack of food, but from lack of something else entirely that her machines could not identify or measure properly. The children slept on medical beds with breathing masks over their faces and IVs in their thin arms, and Claire sat between them, watching their chests rise and fall with each breath and wondering what she had gotten the colony into by opening those gates. Outside, the dragon finally landed in the empty field beyond the colony walls and folded its wings against its body and lowered its head to the ground as if exhausted from the long night of flying and watching and waiting. Kate stood guard at the medical bay door, and she checked her weapon again out of habit and nervous energy that came from not knowing what would happen next, or if she had made the right choice by trusting Claire's decision to bring these strangers inside. Maya worked at her computer trying to find anything in the galactic databases about pointed ear beings and dragons and energy patterns that defied explanation, but every search came back empty with no matches found anywhere. Claire looked at the sleeping children and made a promise to herself that she would save them somehow and figure out what they needed and give it to them, even if it meant risking everything she had worked so hard to build in this colony on the edge of known space. The sun fully rose and bathed the medical bay in natural light, and the children opened their eyes at the same moment and looked at Claire with recognition and gratitude that needed no words to express clearly. One child lifted her hand and pointed toward the window where the dragon could be seen in the distance, and she spoke in that strange language again. But this time Claire understood the emotion behind the words even without translation. They were connected somehow, and the dragon was dying, just like the children were dying, and they needed each other to survive. And time was running out faster than anyone realized. Maya worked through the morning and into the afternoon, trying different translation methods until finally a breakthrough came when she matched the children language to an ancient dialect found in archived signals from the outer rim systems that had gone silent decades ago. The elder child was named Lyra, and her younger sister was called Vina, and they came from a world called Starholm that once floated among silver clouds and crystal mountains, where their people lived for thousands of years in harmony with creatures of scale and flame. Claire listened to the translation with growing horror as Lyra explained in broken phrases what had happened to her world and her people, and why she and Vina had fled across the stars with only their guardian dragon to protect them. The Devourers came without warning and swept across Starholm like a plague of metal and fire, and they consumed everything in their path, turning forests to ash and cities to rubble and people to nothing but memories scattered on the wind. Lyra spoke of warriors who fought bravely with swords that sang and magic that crackled like lightning across the sky, but none of it mattered against the machines that kept coming and coming and coming without end. The dragons fell from the sky one by one as their riders died, and the bond that connected them shattered like glass breaking into a million pieces that could never be put back together the same way again. Starfire was the name of their dragon, and he had carried them away from the destruction, while their mother and father stayed behind to buy them time to escape. And Lyra remembered looking back to see her home burning and knowing she would never return. Claire felt tears in her eyes as she listened to the story, and she reached out to touch Lyra's hand gently, and the child squeezed back with surprising strength. Despite her weakened state, Kate stood in the corner of the medical bay, and her jaw clenched tight as she processed the information about machines that destroyed entire civilizations because she had seen similar things on a smaller scale. During the border wars years ago, Maya pulled up data about the Devourers on her screen, and what little information existed painted a terrifying picture of an enemy that could not be reasoned with or stopped through conventional means. Claire returned to her medical scans, and this time she looked for something specific based on what Lyra had told them about the bond between Dragon and Rider. The energy patterns in the children's bodies were fading like a candle burning down to nothing, and the same patterns appeared in long-range scans of the Dragon resting in the field beyond the colony walls. They were connected through something called a heart link, and it allowed them to share life energy and strength and emotions across any distance as long as the bond remained intact and strong. But the bond was breaking, and Claire could see it in her readings as clear as watching ice melt in the sun, and she knew that when it finally snapped completely, all three of them would die within hours. She explained this to Kate and Maya, and both women looked at her with questions in their eyes about what could be done to prevent this tragedy from unfolding in front of them. Claire had an idea, but it was dangerous and untested, and might kill her in the process of trying to save the children and their dragon. But she felt compelled to try because turning away from suffering was not something she could live with. She proposed using human bioenergy as a bridge to temporarily stabilize the bond while she worked to find a more permanent solution to the problem. Kate immediately volunteered to help, despite the risks, because she had lost her own daughter years ago to raiders, and she could not stand by and watch more children die when she had the power to prevent it. Claire set up equipment around 2 medical chairs, and she and Kate sat down facing each other while Maya monitored the readings on multiple screens that displayed information in graphs and numbers that changed rapidly. Lyra and Vina watched from their beds, with hope shining in their large eyes that reflected the overhead lights. Like mirrors catching sunbeams, Claire activated the system, and immediately felt a surge of energy leave her body and flow outward toward some destination she could not see, but could feel deep in her chest like a second heartbeat. Kate gasped, and gripped the armrests of her chair as the same sensation hit her, and her body went rigid with the strain of channeling more energy than she had ever produced before. The connection formed slowly at first, and then all at once. Claire's mind opened to something vast and ancient and powerful beyond anything she had imagined possible. She saw through Lyra's eyes as the child fled her burning world and felt the terror and grief that no child should ever have to experience. She saw through Starfire's eyes as the dragon fought against impossible odds to protect the precious cargo he carried across the void of space. She saw the devourer swarms descending like locusts made of metal and malice, and she understood that they were not simply machines, but something far worse. They had once been a living species that chose to abandon their bodies and upload their consciousness into mechanical forms, seeking immortality and perfection. But something went wrong, and they became corrupted and twisted, until all that remained was an insatiable hunger to consume and destroy everything organic and beautiful in the universe. Claire saw that the elven people had discovered a weakness in the Devourer programming, but they found it too late to save. Their world, a specific harmonic frequency, could disrupt the networked consciousness that connected all Devourer units and cause them to shut down permanently. But generating such a frequency required immense power far beyond what any single being could produce alone. Claire gasped and pulled back from the connection and found herself breathing hard in the medical chair, with sweat running down her face and her heart pounding. Kate opened her eyes and looked at Claire with an expression of shock and understanding, because she had seen the same visions and felt the same emotions. Maya checked the monitors and announced that the bridge had worked, and the children's life signs were stabilizing, and the dragon energy signature was growing, stronger. But it was only temporary, and Claire knew they had bought maybe 3 or 4 days at most before the bond would fail again. She stood on shaky legs and walked to the window where she could see Starfire in the distance, and the dragon lifted his head and looked directly at her as if sensing her presence. In that moment, Claire made a decision that would change everything for New Haven Colony. She would call a council meeting and present the truth about the Devourers and the threat they posed not just to these refugees but to every human settlement in this sector of space. Because if the machines had tracked Lyra and Vina this far, they would not stop until they found them and destroyed anyone who stood in their way. Kate joined her at the window and spoke quietly about how they needed to prepare for war. even though the colony had no real defenses against an enemy like this. Claire nodded and replied that maybe they did have a defense if they could figure out how to weaponize the harmonic frequency that the elven people had discovered too late. Maya began downloading all the information she could extract from the brief connection, including star charts and technical data about devourer weaknesses and attack patterns. Lyra sat up in her bed and spoke in clearer English than before, as if the connection had given her access to their language somehow. She thanked them for their help and warned them that the devourers would come soon because they never stopped hunting once they picked up a trail. Vina held her sister's hand and both children looked at the humans who had saved them with expressions of gratitude mixed with guilt, because they knew their presence had brought danger to this peaceful place. Claire turned from the window and looked at the children and told them that humanity did not abandon those in need, and that they would find a way to protect everyone. Kate checked her weapon again and began making mental calculations about defensive positions and supply requirements for an extended siege. The sun moved across the sky, and afternoon turned to evening, and still they worked, planning and preparing for something they hoped would never come, but knew was inevitable. In the field outside, Starfire stood and stretched his wings, testing their strength after the energy boost from the temporary bond. The dragon looked toward the colony buildings, and then up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, the devourers were coming, and time was running short for all of them. Beth Parker called the emergency council meeting at sunset, and the main hall filled with colony leaders and department heads who whispered nervously among themselves about why they had been summoned. Claire stood at the front of the room with data, displays behind her showing images of destroyed worlds and mechanical swarms that had consumed entire civilizations. She explained everything she had learned from the connection with Lyra and Vina, and she did not soften the truth or hide the danger that now threatened their colony. The room erupted in angry voices and fearful shouts as people demanded to know why Claire had brought these refugees inside the walls when she knew they were being hunted by something so terrible. A man named Greg stood up and pointed at Claire while saying they should send the children away immediately before the devourers arrived and put every family in the colony at risk. Several others agreed loudly, and the noise grew until Beth raised her hand for silence, and the crowd gradually quieted down to listen. Kate spoke next, and her voice was hard and steady, as she reminded everyone that they had all come to New Haven seeking safety and a better life, and turning away refugees made them no better than the enemies they had fled. A woman named Lisa argued that protecting their own children had to come first, and sacrificing the colony for two strangers made no sense, no matter how sad their story was. Maya presented the technical data about the harmonic frequency weapon and explained that if they could generate it, they might be able to stop the devourers not just here, but across multiple systems. Beth listened to all sides of the argument, and then stood to address the council with a calm voice that carried authority earned through years of good leadership. She said that New Haven was built on principles of helping others and standing against tyranny, and if they abandoned those principles now, they would lose something more important than their lives. The choice was to fight even though the odds were against them, or to run and become the kind of people who let children die to save themselves. Beth called for a vote, and the room went silent, as each person considered what they would choose and what they could live with afterward. The vote took 10 minutes, and when it was done, the results showed a narrow majority in favor of staying and fighting, though many voted with tears in their eyes. Claire felt relief and terror in equal measure because now they had to actually find a way to win against an enemy that had never been defeated. Kate immediately began organizing defense plans and calling for volunteers to help fortify the colony walls and set up weapons positions around the perimeter. Maya worked with the engineering team to design equipment that could generate the harmonic frequency if they could find a power source strong enough to make it work. Claire returned to the medical bay, where Lyra and Vina waited for news about what the humans had decided. She told them that New Haven would stand with them and fight, and the children cried tears of gratitude that ran down their glowing cheeks. Lyra explained that the only way to generate enough power for the weapon was through a fully restored heart link between Dragon and Riders. But Starfire was still too weak, and the temporary bridge would not provide enough energy, even with dozens of humans channeling their life force. Claire asked if there was another way, and Lyra hesitated before speaking about something called a mass bonding that her people had used once in ancient history. It required many individuals to link together with a dragon at the center, acting as a focus point for all their combined energy. The process was incredibly dangerous and people died from the strain, but those who survived became permanently connected in ways that changed them forever. Claire understood what had to be done, and she sent out a call for volunteers explaining, honestly, what the procedure would cost and what it might achieve. Kate was the first to step forward, followed by Maya and then Nina Wells from the research team, and then others began raising their hands. Within an hour, 200 colonists had volunteered, knowing full well they might die but choosing to try anyway because the alternative was unthinkable. They spent the next day preparing the equipment and the volunteers, while scouts watched the skies for any sign of approaching devourers. Lyra taught Claire the ancient bonding ritual that her people had used and explained how to channel the energy properly, so it would flow through the network without burning out the participants. Starfire was brought closer to the colony, and the dragon settled in the central square where the bonding would take place. The volunteers gathered at dawn on the second day, and they held hands in concentric circles around the dragon. While Claire and Kate stood closest to Starfire, massive head Lyra and Vina climbed onto the dragon back, and their small hands touched his scales gently, and the dragon rumbled deep in his chest like distant thunder. Claire activated the bonding equipment and immediately felt the energy begin to flow, not just from her, but from everyone in the circle. It was like standing in a river of light that pulled harder and harder until she thought she would be swept away completely. Some volunteers fell to the ground unable to handle the strain, and medical teams rushed to help them, while others stepped forward to take their places. Nina Wells collapsed with blood running from her nose, but she smiled as she watched Starfire wings begin to glow with increasing brightness. The dragon energy built and built until it seemed like the air itself would catch fire from the power crackling through the space. Starfire opened his eyes fully for the first time since arriving at New Haven, and they blazed with light that made everyone shield their faces. The heart link snapped back into place stronger than ever, and Lyra gasped as the full connection restored itself and flowed through her. And Vina Claire felt everything the dragon felt, and the children felt, and all 200 volunteers felt. And it was overwhelming, and beautiful, and terrifying. Then the long-range sensors began screaming with alerts, and everyone who could still stand turned to look at the sky. The Devourers had arrived 3 days early, and there were more of them than anyone had expected. Kate pulled herself up and grabbed her weapon while shouting orders to defensive positions. The sky darkened with mechanical forms that descended like a swarm of locusts, and their weapons began charging with sounds that made the air vibrate. Starfire stood, and the volunteers, who could still move, scattered to safety as the dragon spread wings that now glowed with power. Drawn from 200 human souls, Lyra looked down at Claire from the dragon back and spoke in perfect English, now fully connected to their language. Through the mass bonding, she said that humanity had given them a gift beyond measure, and now they would repay it with everything they had. Starfire launched into the sky with speed that created a shockwave across the square, and the dragon roared, with a sound that carried the harmonic frequency in its voice. The nearest Devourer machines began shutting down and falling from the sky like dead birds dropping from the air. But there were thousands more coming, and the mothership hung in orbit above the planet, adjusting its programming to compensate for the frequency. Claire realized they had bought time, but not victory, and the real battle was just beginning. The Devourer machines fell like rain for the first few minutes as Starfire harmonic roar disrupted their systems and sent them crashing into the fields around New Haven Colony. Kate rallied the defense forces and positioned them along the walls, while colonists who could not fight moved into the underground shelters carrying children and supplies. Maya worked frantically at her computer, tracking the enemy movements, and realized with growing dread that the machines were adapting faster than expected. The mothership in orbit began deploying a new wave of units that were shielded against the harmonic frequency, and these advanced models descended toward the colony with weapons that glowed. An angry red starfire engaged them in aerial combat, and the sky lit up with energy blasts and dragon fire that turned night into day. Claire watched from the command center as casualties began mounting, and defensive positions fell one by one to the relentless mechanical assault. She knew they needed more time and more power, but the volunteers from the mass bonding were exhausted, and many were still unconscious in the medical bay. Nina Wells had died from the strain, and 3 others with her and Claire felt the weight of those deaths pressing down on her shoulders. Lyra's voice came through the communication system, speaking from Dragonback as Starfire fought. She said the mothership was the key, and if they could destroy it, the remaining Devourers would lose coordination and become easier to defeat. But the mothership shields were too strong for conventional weapons, and even Starfire could not penetrate them alone. Kate fired her weapon until it overheated, and then grabbed another one and kept firing as machines broke through the outer wall and pushed into the colony streets. She fought beside farmers and scientists who had never held weapons before, but who stood their ground because they had nowhere left to run. A Devourer unit cornered Kate in an alley, and she was out of ammunition and wounded from a blast that had caught her shoulder. The machine raised its weapon to finish her, and Kate closed her eyes, thinking of her daughter and hoping she had done enough to make a difference. Then a shadow passed overhead, and the machine exploded in a burst of dragon fire as Starfire swept past, protecting the humans below. Kate laughed despite the pain and got back to her feet and returned to the fight with renewed determination. In the command center, Claire studied the mothership scan data, looking for any weakness they could exploit. Maya pointed out that the ship power core was vulnerable during energy transfer when it recharged the shields after absorbing attacks. The window would be small, maybe 10 seconds at most, but if they could hit it during that moment, they might crack the shields. Claire asked how they could generate enough power to penetrate even weakened shields, and Maya had no answer that made sense. Then Claire remembered something from the mass bonding vision, and she called Lyra on the communication channel. She asked if a dragon could overload its own energy core deliberately and use the explosion as a weapon. Lyra was silent for a long moment before answering that, yes, it was possible, but the dragon would die and anyone bonded to it would die as well. Claire felt sick at the thought, but she could not see any other option that would save the colony. Kate heard the conversation through her communication earpiece, and she shouted, "No," over the channel while fighting off 3 machines at once. Beth Parker spoke up from her position in the shelter and said they could not ask children to sacrifice themselves no matter how desperate things became. But Lyra said quietly that she and Vina had already lost everything except each other and Starfire, and if their deaths could save this world, then it was a choice worth making. Claire started to protest, but then the command center shook from an explosion, and part of the wall collapsed inward. Devourer machines poured through the breach, and Maya grabbed a weapon to defend the equipment, while Claire tried to think of another solution. Outside, the colony was burning and people were dying, and Starfire was tiring from fighting too many enemies for too long. The dragon took several hits and began losing altitude while Lyra and Vina held on desperately. Claire made a decision that went against everything she believed, but seemed like the only path forward. She told Lyra to prepare for the core overload, but to wait for her signal when the mothership shields dropped. Then Claire activated the bonding network again and sent out a call to every volunteer who could still respond. She explained what needed to happen and asked if they would give everything they had left to strengthen Starfire for one final attack. The responses came back one by one as volunteers dragged themselves to the equipment and reconnected to the network, despite their exhaustion. Kate ran back to the command center and reconnected even though she could barely stand. Maya finished fighting off the machines and sat down at her station to join the network. Beth left the shelter and returned to the surface to add her energy to the collective. Effort 200 became 150, as some could not answer the call, but those who remained gave everything without hesitation. The energy flowed into Starfire, and the dragon scales began to glow brighter than the sun. Lyra felt the power building, and she knew what it meant for her and Vina, and she held her sister close. Vina was crying, but she nodded when Lyra asked if she was ready. The mothership fired a massive beam at the colony, intending to destroy everything in one-shot. Starfire intercepted the beam and absorbed its energy into the already overloaded core. The dragon began to shine with light that hurt to look at directly. Maya tracked the mothership shields and saw them drop as the ship recharged from the massive energy expenditure. She shouted the coordinates, and Claire gave the signal. Starfire dove toward the mothership with Lyra and Vina on his back, and all the colonists' energy flowing through the heart link. The dragon was a comet of pure power streaking across the sky, but then something unexpected happened. The energy from 200 human souls did not just strengthen Starfire, it transformed the bond itself. Instead of breaking when the dragon core exploded, the bond spread outward and anchored into every volunteer simultaneously. Claire felt it happening and understood in that instant what humanity had become. Not just helpers or allies, but true guardians bonded to something ancient and powerful. Starfire reached the mothership and the dragon did not self-destruct. Instead, the energy pulsed outward in waves that carried the harmonic frequency amplified 1,000-fold. The effect was instantaneous and total. Every devourer in the sector shut down at once, including the mothership, which went dark and began drifting in orbit. On the ground, the machines simply stopped moving and toppled over like puppets with cut strings. The colonists stared in shock as silence fell across the battlefield. Then Kate started laughing, and others joined in with laughter that turned to tears of relief in the sky. Starfire hovered with wings spread wide, and Lyra and Vina were still alive on his back, waving down at the colony. The bond had not broken, because humanity had changed it into something new, something that could not be destroyed because it was shared among so many. Claire collapsed in her chair as the energy drain finally caught up with her. She smiled as darkness took her, knowing they had won. Claire woke up 3 days later in a medical bed surrounded by flowers that colonists had left while she was unconscious, and the sunlight streaming through the window felt warm on her face. Kate sat in a chair beside the bed, and her wounded shoulder was bandaged, but she smiled when Claire's eyes opened and she squeezed her friend's hand gently. The battle was over and New Haven had survived, though the cost had been high with 47 colonists dead and many more wounded. Nina Wells was being honored with a memorial in the central square along with the others who had given their lives during the mass bonding. Maya entered the room carrying data tablets, and her eyes were bright with excitement as she began explaining what had happened. After Claire lost consciousness, the harmonic pulse had traveled across light years of space, disrupting devourer networks in dozens of systems and giving other civilizations a chance to fight back. Messages were coming in from colonies that had been under siege, reporting that the machines had suddenly powered down. Humanity had not just saved themselves, but had struck a blow against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. Claire asked about Lyra and Vina, and Kate told her the children were healthy and happy and currently teaching colonists about elven culture and language. The bond was permanent now, and every volunteer could feel the connection to Starfire and to each other like a constant presence in the back of their minds. It was strange, but not unpleasant, and it made them aware of each other's emotions and needs in ways that brought the community closer together. Beth Parker visited later that day, and she thanked Claire for making the difficult choices that had saved them all. She said New Haven would become a symbol of cooperation between species and a haven for refugees fleeing the Devourer War. The colony would need to expand and build defenses and prepare for the possibility that the machines might adapt and return someday, but they would face those challenges together, as a united people bonded by more than just shared goals. Claire slowly recovered over the next week, and she began working on ways to strengthen the harmonic weapon and share the technology with other human settlements. Lyra visited her often, and the child had grown more confident and happy, though sadness still showed in her eyes when she spoke of her lost world. One afternoon, Lyra brought Claire outside to the field where Starfire rested. The dragon looked at Claire with intelligence that seemed deeper now, as if the bond with humans had changed him too. Lyra explained that Starfire wanted to thank the humans and show them something special. She led Claire to a hidden cave at the edge of the colony territory, and inside were 3 large eggs that pulsed with the same glow that came from elven skin. Starfire had laid them before the final battle and hidden them as a gift for the future. These eggs would hatch in a few months, and the dragons born from them would bond with human children, creating the next generation of guardians. Kate came to see the eggs, and she touched one gently with tears running down her cheeks. She said it gave her hope for the future and helped heal the pain of losing her daughter so many years ago. Maya began documenting everything about dragon care and bonding procedures, so future generations would know how to maintain the partnerships. The colony threw a celebration when Claire was fully recovered, and people danced in the streets with music and laughter filling the air. Lyra and Vina performed traditional elven songs, and their voices were beautiful enough to make grown soldiers cry. Kate taught Lyra how to shoot, and the girl, natural grace combined, with human determination made her an excellent marksman. The two spent hours together on the practice range, and Kate found herself caring for Lyra like the daughter she had lost. Beth announced plans to build a school where human and elven children could learn together and share their different knowledge. Claire returned to her research, but now with a new purpose of understanding the bond and finding ways to use it to help others. She wrote papers about cross-species connections and bioenergy. Networks that were studied by scientists across human space messages came from Earth itself, requesting information about New Haven's success against the Devourers. The colony became famous, and people wanted to visit and learn and see the miracle that had happened here. But life also returned to normal in many ways as farmers planted crops and children played and families gathered for meals. The only difference was the constant awareness of connection that everyone bonded to Starfire could feel. It was like having an extended family that stretched across the entire colony and beyond. One night, Claire stood on the wall watching the stars and thinking about everything that had changed. Kate joined her, and they stood in comfortable silence for a while. Kate finally spoke and said she was glad Claire had opened those gates the night the children arrived. Claire replied that she was glad Kate had trusted her even when it seemed crazy. They laughed and went back inside where warm lights and friendly voices waited in the field. Starfire slept with Lyra and Vina curled against his side, and the dragon dreams were filled with hope. The eggs in the cave glowed brighter as the life inside them grew stronger. New Haven had become something unprecedented and beautiful, a place where humans and elves lived together as family, where dragons would soon fly again with human children on their backs, where the hunger that had brought them together had been satisfied, not with food, but with connection and courage and the simple refusal to let others suffer alone. Claire had discovered that the children crying about hunger were not starving for nutrition, but for belonging, for someone to stand with them when everything else was lost, and humanity, with all its flaws, had answered that need, not because it was easy or safe or logical, but because it was right. That choice had changed everything. The colony grew and prospered in the months that followed. Other refugees arrived seeking the sanctuary that New Haven offered, and they were welcomed. The dragon eggs hatched, and 3 small dragons bonded with human children, who cried with joy at the connection. Kate adopted Lyra officially, and the girl called her mom for the first time, making the tough security officer cry happy tears. Vina bonded with one of the new dragons and became the first rider of the next generation. Maya continued her research and made breakthroughs in understanding alien technology that helped humanity advance. Beth led the colony with wisdom and compassion, and New Haven became a model for other settlements. Claire watched it all unfold and felt proud of what they had built together. The scars from the battle remained, but they served as reminders of what people could accomplish when they chose courage over fear. The Devourer threat was not gone entirely, but it had been diminished, and humanity now had allies and weapons and knowledge to continue the fight. Most importantly, they had hope. Hope that different species could work together. Hope that even ancient evils could be defeated. Hope that choosing to help others would lead to a better future for everyone. Claire stood in her lab looking at data about the bond network and smiling. She had asked what the doctor discovered, and the answer was simple. Humanity discovered that it was capable of greatness when it chose to be. That hunger came in many forms, but connection satisfied them all. That children crying for help deserved to be answered no matter the cost, and that sometimes opening a gate to strangers was the bravest thing anyone could do. New Haven thrived under twin suns, with dragons flying overhead and children laughing below. The story of 2 little girls who cried about hunger had become legend, but the truth was better than any legend could capture, because the real story was about the humans who heard those cries and decided to act, who gave everything to save lives they had never met, who changed the galaxy by refusing to turn away from suffering. That was what the doctor discovered. That was what changed everything.